Thanks for coming and listening to this 5th episode of True Ghost Stories. I'm Dave Mace, and your host and guide to the unknown. I'm a long-time paranormal researcher, and have heard and seen many strange things. Most were explainable, but there are a few that leave little doubt in my mind that we can learn more about the world in which we live. My approach to researching the paranormal is less about ghosts and more about people. People are always at the center of any strange occurrences, and it's kind of like the old question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around, does it make a noise? Do ghosts walk the halls of a building if no one is there to experience them? Or are they just figments of our imagination? When I do research on a reported haunted location, a lot of historical research goes into each case. Not only does the history of a location provide insight into the lives of people from the past, but also provides provenance for any evidence you may gather. It can also be an indicator that the experiences are not related to the past, and it may be the imaginary creations of the ones having the experience. For this podcast, we'll delve into the Preston School of Industry in Ione, California, better known as Preston Castle. It was built in 1890 as an alternative to sending youthful offenders to San Quentin. Back then, the courts had few options of where they would send children who committed serious crimes. Sometimes boys as young as 12 would share the same prison cell as a hardened criminal. Even back then, they realized that this was not something that was very desirable. Preston Castle has long been said to be haunted, and it appears on many of the popular paranormal cable television shows. But why should it be more haunted than any other location? Perhaps looking at the history will shed some light on this mystery. It could have started long before the construction of the castle even began. It's said that a Miwok village occupied the site way above the landscape up on the hill, and there's some evidence that there's archaeological artifacts that were found up there, indicating that's true. Perhaps the desecration of tribal lands is too much for ancient spirits to tolerate. Then there are the building materials themselves. The bricks were made by inmates of San Quentin and Folsom Prison and shipped to the building site. Maybe the very walls of the building are infused with negative or dark energy as hardened felons of the late 1800s fashioned the stone blocks within the prison yards. Each prisoner was certainly filled with hate, dismay, hopelessness, and fear as they toiled under the watchful eyes of the guards. If rock can absorb emotion and memories, then these sandstone bricks would certainly be fully charged. But that's not the only negative energy to be unleashed on Preston Castle. On June 13th, 1894, the first wards arrived at the castle to begin their internment at Preston. Some boys were simply orphans or runaways, while others were thieves and even murderers. Especially in the early days, there were reports of brutality by staff and guards. There were many complaints and reports of beatings and floggings by guards, but it's hard to know if all of them were true, or if the stories were just fabricated by the boys in order to pressure and manipulate the staff. Evidence exists that it's likely that both the beatings and the false claims occurred at various times for various reasons. When you consider the mindset of people that lived in the 1890s and the remoteness of the castle and human nature itself, there's the possibility that at least a few of the more troublesome inmates may have died at the hands of those entrusted to watch over them. Many of the boys had no guardians outside the walls. while others lived far away. A letter from the warden telling the parents that their son died from influenza or tuberculosis, or one of the other many hazards that existed in the trade school, was all that was needed. They say that the reasons for hauntings often include unjust, sudden, or violent death. If that's true, then there's a potential for hauntings here. There is evidence that shows that the older boys that were nearing their mandatory release dates due to their age would make deals with younger inmates. They would do a fake escape. The younger boy would report the escape to the guards, and the older boy would give up quickly and serve out the remainder of their term. The younger boy was rewarded with extra early release points and would be paroled early. It cost the older boys nothing, and they got to help out a friend. There was a lot of controversy throughout Preston's history. Several youths were killed by guards during escapes, and some of the early superintendents were beyond cruel. After several official inquiries and investigations and replacements of offending superintendents, things seemed to calm down at Preston for a while. Then escapes started becoming more commonplace. And on April 19, 1919, things came to a head. Samuel Goines had arrived a year earlier. Despite the fact that he was to be released 2 months from that date, Goines and another boy, Joe Lopez, snuck out beyond the walls and made a run for it. This would be Goines' third and final escape attempt. The guards, along with a tracking dog, gave chase and located the boys at the Thornton Ranch. Officer John Kelly reportedly yelled at the boys to stop. When they failed to do so, he raised his rifle, and he said he aimed at leg level. According to Kelly, he fired with the intent of hitting the boy in the legs, but the shot was high and he struck Goines in the back. Goines died several hours later. It should be noted that Joe Lopez died almost 8 months to the day after that incident, reportedly of bronchial pneumonia. Lopez had testified in the guard's behalf, resulting in the guard being exonerated. Even though there's no evidence to support this, some believe that he may have been killed to make sure he did not recant his testimony. It was September 25th, 2010. My daughter, Christy, and I drove to Ione and met up with another group at a nearby pizza place. After getting a bite to eat, we drove to the castle and contacted 2 docents who would accompany us until about 4 a.m. After a tour of the castle, we broke into 2 groups and started our investigation. My first observation of anything potentially paranormal was as we walked through the second-story halls. We all heard it. It sounded like one of those old hospital beds being dragged across the floor. It was loud and sustained. Not the sound of an owl or many of the other wild creatures that occasionally visit the old building. It was a definite, long, metallic, dragging sound. There's no machinery in the building, and during the investigation, all of the circuit breakers are turned off. The other half of the group had gone to the basement and had heard nothing. As we made our way around in the darkness, we came down one flight of stairs and eventually came to the old infirmary. There's one section where several old 1940s-style hospital beds are staged, and where patients might have spent time recovering, or not recovering. There were no mattresses on the beds, and just the metal frames and springs. There was no indication that they had moved, but they certainly seemed like the likely source of such a horrific noise. While in the infirmary, we heard various noises coming from the adjoining room that sounded like someone pushing on the bed springs. Then I noticed and actually recorded a drop in temperature in that room. People in the room, myself included, kept seeing movement in the darkness through the glass partitions that divided the infirmary area. It was almost as if someone or something was darting around in the darkness, trying to avoid being seen. Later in the evening, my daughter kept feeling someone touch her on the arm. Initially, she thought it was something falling off the old crumbling ceilings, but nothing was falling off, and it kept happening. There was no debris, nothing on her arm, no insects. It seems that younger women who visit Preston Castle often report being touched on the arm or back. Not surprising, really, if you consider that perhaps the spirit of young boys who rarely saw girls might still be there. As the hours wore on, things seemed to quiet down. In fact, unnaturally quiet. I decided to take my camera and walk the halls by myself. As soon as I was away from the rest of the group, the rooms and the halls around me seemed to come alive with noises. I could hear shuffling and steps. I was sure that there were people coming up the stairs and moving in adjoining rooms. There wasn't anyone there. I returned to the group and we all took a break. The castle has several natural residents living around the grounds, probably the most interesting of the large barn owls that circle the tower and screech. Their apparent dislike for late-night visitors is apparent. Just sitting out front, you can see a variety of animals making their nightly rounds. Fox, possum, skunks, just to name a few. I'm not really afraid of ghosts, but I am a little concerned about wild animals and encountering them in the dark. After our break, the group went to the upstairs regions of the castle, and we descended into the basement. The basement was the scene of the historic and brutal murder of the head housekeeper, Anna Corbin. On February 23, 1950, her badly beaten body was found wrapped in a blanket and placed in a storeroom. A suspect was arrested, but after 3 court trials, he was eventually found not guilty. It should be noted that several years later, he was convicted of bludgeoning and raping another woman. I don't think Anna's spirit is still at the castle, but I do think many of the boys' energies remain. 17 boys did die while interned at the castle. And, for at least a few, it was probably the only real home they ever had. It wasn't all bad for the boys. Many learned viable trades, discipline, and got their education while there. For those that stayed out of trouble and followed the rules, life wasn't too bad. After about 2 a.m., it starts getting tiring walking around the old, huge building, especially when you're hauling around heavy video and camera equipment. There were 5 of us in the group, and we all found chairs and sat quietly in the darkness. The room we sat in had several many purposes over the years. It was a chapel, cafeteria, and a dorm room. It was the first dorm room. I placed my digital recorder on the cement floor next to me so I wouldn't create any errant noises from just handling the recorder. And we just sat. At one point, I noticed a strange breathing noise that seemed to come from just outside the room. Initially, I wasn't alarmed, but it continued. As I listened, I thought maybe one of the other team members had a stuffy nose. Finally, after about 10 minutes, I asked, "Does anyone else hear like a breathing noise?" My daughter immediately responded, "Yeah, I thought it was Someone's nose. Once we decided it wasn't coming from any of us, I went to investigate. As I walked out of the room and down the hall, the noise seemed to get louder. I kept walking, and I found my way to a door that leads outside. The sound was coming from outside the door. I unlatched the door, and I applied a little force to get it open. As soon as it opened, the noise stopped. I stuck my head out, and I looked around the open, barren courtyard. My eyes followed the old brick wall up to the top. One of the local barn owls had leaned over and screeched, causing me to jump. It was looking at me and appeared annoyed at being disturbed by a mere human. I took a deep breath, and it was then that I realized that the noise we heard was the rhythmic vocalizations of the owl. It's funny how a place like Preston Castle can make every encounter seem paranormal. I laughed at myself and returned to the rest of the group and told them what I had discovered. After a good chuckle, we returned to our silent vigil. After about an hour, we decided that there was nothing really going on, so we packed up our gear and continued on our search. Throughout the rest of the night, people claimed to have your standard ghost hunting experiences, like lights jumping on the EMF detectors and knocking noises and so on, but nothing as exciting as a full-bodied apparition or poltergeist activity. My daughter wasn't feeling well and had decided to go lay down on some vintage pews in the room near the front door. My group went out to their cars, and we all waited for the remaining group to finish up on the second floor. I went to make sure my daughter was okay, since she was alone in a haunted castle. While I was waiting, I decided to go and retrieve my trap camera from the infirmary. I walked down the hall and saw the camera where I had strapped it to a post. I quietly undid the strap and placed it in my canvas bag. As I walked back to the front door, I encountered the other group coming down the stairs. The first few people were chatting, and I sensed they were annoyed. One of them yelled to me, "What the hell were you doing down there?" I was a bit taken aback by this. I asked what they meant. They said, "It sounded like you were throwing boulders around down here." "When?" They said, "Just a few minutes ago." I had to stop and think for a second. Was I making noises? No. In fact, I didn't make any noise. And certainly nothing to the extent that they were talking about. It also seemed odd, since any noise that loud surely would have been heard throughout the entire castle, and I didn't hear a thing. It was the end of the night, and I was satisfied I experienced some strange things, but I was tired and still had a long drive home. Ione is fairly remote, with 2-lane roads in and out of the town and a few buildings along the way. My daughter and I got in the car and made our uneventful trip back home. The next day I sat down, started browsing through my collected evidence, and after viewing the video, photos, and trap camera captures, I was a little dismayed I hadn't captured anything. The reality is paranormal investigators rarely find anything. So I wasn't surprised, just disappointed. Then I turned to my digital recorder. I came across many unidentified sounds and maybe a couple of unintelligible voices, but I couldn't make out anything they were saying and couldn't say for sure that they weren't the voices of other members off in the distance. Who knows, maybe some of the sounds were that crazy owl that scared the crap out of me earlier in the evening. As I got to the section of the recording where we were all in the basement, I almost skipped it. After all, other than that owl, there hadn't been a single indication of anything paranormal going on. But then I figured I might as well just finish up here, and I adjusted my headphones and clicked play. As I listened, I could imagine the Preston Castle basement. The sounds transported me back to that time and place as I listened to the recording. I could hear the occasional shuffle of somebody's feet or the crack of a metal chair as they adjusted their position. A couple of sniffles, a couple of coughs. Then I hear a raspy voice. I wasn't really focused as much as I should have been, and I just heard the 3 syllables. I quickly noted the counter and did a quick reverse and play, and I heard it. The seemingly male voice said, "I'm so scared." I played it again and again, and there was no doubt in my mind what it said. It said, "I'm so scared." Here's the actual recording. Tell me what you think. I'll never know what the source of that voice was. I do know it didn't come from anyone on our team. I was the only male in our group, and I know I didn't say it. As a paranormal researcher, I always shy away from reading too much into any evidence collected. In this case, I just couldn't help it. I couldn't help but thinking that perhaps there was a trapped soul there that was terrified, had been there for hundreds of years, feeling fear. Or maybe it was just the voice repeating something said many, many years earlier. Perhaps the thoughts or emotions of a scared young ward from 100 years ago was embedded into the walls and floors, as is believed by many people who believe in what they call the stone tape theory. Whatever the reason, I had no explanation for the voice. It was a classic EVP, or electronic voice phenomena. For my money, Preston Castle is haunted. Not haunted like Hollywood haunted, but something more subtle, something somewhat viscous that hangs in the air and only moves in the peripheries of your vision. Walking alone in the castle is a real experience, but it's not for everyone. I rather enjoy it. Preston Castle is an impressive structure with a long and sometimes violent history, and if any place deserves to be haunted, then I'm sure Preston qualifies. Whenever I've been at the castle, I've always had the feeling that there were other people there as well, even when I was alone. I always had that feeling that something or someone was there with me, not menacing or an evil presence, more like the feeling of presence you get when you walk down the hall of an office building. You may not see anyone, but you know there's people there. It's been a while since I've been to the castle, and I'm planning to bring a small group there this November. For many people coming with me, this will be their first time, not only going to Preston, but doing a paranormal investigation. Hopefully, I'll be able to do what I like to do best, and that's giving people a glimpse of the unknown from outside the veil. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I invite you to visit my site, www.outsidetheveil.com. If you would like some additional information on Preston Castle, just find the corresponding page titled The Castle at my site, located under the Truth tab. There I've posted some photos and audio files of past visits to the castle, along with some links to some other resources. The castle does allow people to tour during the day for a nominal fee, and you can arrange nighttime investigations. Thank you again for visiting. I'm Dave Mace, And you can always find me here, outside the veil.